Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Russia is committing its genocidal war against Ukraine and openly threatens most of the Western nations. While Russia's threats are loud and clear, the politics of many Western capitals like Washington or Berlin is mostly focused on so-called de-escalation. Can one stop Russia's aggression with de-escalatory rhetorics, or should one focus more on good old deterrence? To discuss this, we have invited Dr. Toms Rostoks, who is a senior researcher at the National Defense Academy of Latvia, and his interests are deterrence, state institutions, and Russia foreign policy and strategy. Welcome, Dr. Rostoks.
Hello. Thanks for having me on the program.
Thank you very much for having joined our program and focusing on the main issue of this war and how to stop Russia. How can we understand the intentions of Russia, or better to say, how can the politicians who take decisions understand the intentions of Russia and act responsibly?
Well, I think that there are very few illusions regarding Russia's intentions. So there was obviously a lot of debate until 2024 about what Russia's intentions are. Is Russia kind of this? Russia was not perceived as a status quo power, but then the real question was about whether Russia is a limited aims revisionist or unlimited aims revisionist. To some extent, that debate is still ongoing, but I think that in the context of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, Russia's war aims are fairly clear. Russia will go as far as it can, and so it must be stopped. So I think this is where Russia's intentions are fairly clear. But then the question obviously is about how to, let's say, constrain the conflict, how to limit the conflict, because the West doesn't want to find itself at a shooting war with Russia.
And this is exactly what many in Berlin discuss. Like, how far will Russia go? Maybe Russia will stop in Kherson. Maybe Russia will stop in Zaporizhia, but it will definitely not dare to attack NATO. Because we are much more powerful than Russia, and they will not dare to do it. But at the same time, we know that Russia openly discusses attacking NATO, and Russia perceives NATO as a weak adversary. What is the truth here, and can Russia attack NATO? Or maybe the attack against NATO will look differently as people in Berlin imagine?
Again, we can't really know for sure, because intentions are in people's heads and we can't observe them directly. But with regard to Russia's estimations of NATO deterrence and security guarantees, I have the impression that Russia expects NATO's red lines greatly. The problem for Ukraine, obviously, is that NATO's red lines were not drawn on the border between Ukraine and Russia. The red line was drawn on the border between Russia and NATO. So, and that was done at the start of the conflict, defending every inch of NATO's territory. So I think that was very clear. But then during the course of the conflict, there has been a lot of back and forth about where Russia's red lines are. And I think that the West has respected these imaginary red lines that Russia might have had too much. So there's been, we've been afraid of doing things that would have been perfectly normal during a war.
When you talk about defending NATO's territory and red lines, NATO red lines, which have been drawn not on the border between Ukraine and Russia, but on the border between NATO and Ukraine, have not we seen Russian drones falling on the territory of NATO, Romania, Russian missiles falling on territory of Poland, violating Polish airspace? In Romania, Russian drones violate NATO airspace repeatedly. It is standard tactics for them to fly through Romania. And not only that, recently, Polish Ministry of Defense requested U.S. permission to shoot down Russian missiles which fly over Poland, which lets us assume that there has been no such permission, which is ridiculously on the end of the third year of full-scale war.
Well, indeed, there have been incidents during the ongoing war, and almost 2 months ago, so it was early September, a Russian drone crashed on the territory of Latvia as well. It traveled over Belarus, crashed in Latvia, and it had explosives on it. So it was a Shahed type drone. And obviously these incidents call into question the Western policies that have been pursued up until this far. And of course, my answer would be that it's not necessarily because of these incidents the West should do more to help Ukraine and to stand up to Russia, but it's because of the Western strategic interests that are at stake in Ukraine. And so these violations of airspace, for instance, yes, they've been repeated. They've happened repeatedly, but on the other hand, I also don't think that we haven't seen much of escalation on Russia's part with regard to NATO member states. I don't think Russia can afford a war against NATO, and these have been treated as incidents by the Western countries, even though some of them have had fatal consequences for citizens of NATO states, as a couple of years ago in Poland. So they've been treated as incidents. But again, I don't think that incidents should drive Western policy. The Western policy should be driven by its clear understanding of the strategic interests at stake in Ukraine.
Indeed, and we are talking about Western interests and interests of freedom and democracy. Before we go further in this interview, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel so you will never miss interviews like this. And Dr. Rostoks, you have already mentioned this understanding or very unsolid formulation. Where are the red lines? What should we do if, and what is our global strategy in this war? And I every time when Russia goes a step further, I remember how the West, and in particular the US president, or even the US presidents, Barack Obama and Joe Biden later, drawn the American red lines, first in Syria with usage of chemical weapons, and later in Ukraine, once again with usage of chemical weapons. And Joe Biden said that Russia's usage of chemical weapons, if Russia would dare to do it, will have grave consequences for Russia. Now we know there are more than 400 recorded cases in Ukraine along the front line of Russian troops using chemical warfare. And Russian state media report on that, and Russian soldiers post videos from the drones dropping gas grenades on Ukrainian positions, in particular chlorpicrin. There came no response from the US, despite the fact that the red line which Joe Biden has drawn in Ukraine has been clearly crossed. I don't say about is it good or bad to draw a red line and then let it be crossed, but what does it mean for Russia? How does Russia perceive this?
So clearly, from Russia's perspective, this will be seen as weakness, something that they can get away with, and once they cross the red line once, they might as well cross it twice or a few hundred times, as you mentioned, with the usage of chemical weapons against Ukraine. From the Western perspective, again, my thinking is that the point is not so much with the red lines. I mean, crossing of the red lines could be used as a pretext for doing something. So escalating, providing more assistance to Ukraine, which is clearly necessary. But again, these red lines are I mean, what's more important is to have a clear objective with regard to what the West wants to accomplish in Ukraine, while avoiding a major military confrontation between NATO and Russia, which would, from the Western perspective, be too risky. Now, my comment on this would be that this has turned into a war of attrition. That's clear. Everybody understands that. Wars of attrition, they favor larger, more powerful, more populous states. That is clear also. And I think that not doing enough and constraining ourselves and constraining Ukraine, we are not being able to accomplish our strategic objectives. So war is not going in Ukraine's favor. And I think that in the worst case scenario, next year, perhaps, if the war is going progressively worse for Ukraine, NATO states would have to face very difficult choices. Either Russia will be able to impose its will on Ukraine and take more territory. And Russia's approach has clearly been that Russia would make these great sacrifices for very little territory. But then their idea probably is that in a war of attrition, the ratio between casualties on the Russian side and gains would change during the conflict, so that Russia would progressively suffer less casualties and it would make larger gains. And Russia is suffering as well. That's also clear. But I think that they are expecting a very large payoff at the end of this conflict. And since Ukraine is fighting against a more powerful adversary, then limiting Ukraine is counterproductive. If Ukraine loses Western credibility, will be severely damaged. And also, NATO will be in this very uncomfortable position that if Ukraine is on the brink of losing the war, then, the West might throw weapons at Ukraine, but it might not produce the results that we want. And that would be a very problematic stage in a war, because in the West, you would have to discuss, either we let Russia prevail or we escalate. And given the fact that there's been not much willingness to escalate and take risks over the past almost 3 years, then I just don't see how Western politicians would all of a sudden wake up and be ready to take additional risks. Now, the context right now is fairly important. I suspect that the American president might not want to take risks because of the election that's upcoming, and we'll see his own personal position on this war right after the election. So lame duck presidents are exactly that, lame duck, but they're still presidents and they can make important decisions. They can do away with these restrictions on the usage of American weapons with regard to targets in Russia. Biden may provide more military assistance after the election, whatever the outcome of the election.
But that is another layer of this war, the dependence of Ukraine on the Western support. And here we have seen the stretching of Ukrainians' rhetorics between asking for help and criticizing for not helping. And then Ukraine has exhausted practically every argument, moral argument of support of democracy, economic arguments, and calculation argument, like you need to support us because Russia is your enemy too, and we are fighting your enemy, practically making ultimate sacrifice of life of our soldiers instead of you. And the other, even threats, like if you don't arm us, we will try to get our own nuclear bomb, because we have been deprived of nuclear weapons in exchange of your guarantees. Your guarantees didn't work, so you wanted to escape the nuclear proliferation. You have got it, and nothing of these arguments worked. not nice moral arguments, neither very clear economic and strategic arguments, no threat. Why is the West so fixating? And I'm talking now, of course, mostly about Berlin and Washington, not about Riga, Tallinn, or Vilnius. Why is the West so fixated on this imaginary de-escalation while it is proven on the ground that de-escalation of the West leads to escalation from the Russian side?
Well, I think there are two things. One thing would be about policy. The war has been ongoing for almost 3 years, and I would say that for much of the time, at the start of the war, Western policy was formed. So the West had to formulate its assistance to Ukraine, approach to Russia, and calibrate its response. When the policy is set, it's very hard to change it. That is the problem. Coming from academia, I know that there's literature which basically tells you that policy changes usually when it fails catastrophically, or when there's a danger that it will do so. And apparently, I think that the Western approach has been based on this assumption that the present policy is not necessarily succeeding, but it's not failing either. So it's good enough. And I'll talk about this in a minute. But the problem with this policy is that it's not really producing the results that we want. This policy is based on the assumption that with the economic and military assistance that Ukraine is being given, that it will be enough to defend itself. But it increasingly looks like that the West is under-delivering when it comes to assistance, and Russia is grinding its way forward. So I think that there's this issue of a clearly set policy towards the war, and also this assumption that the current policy, although it's not very good, it's not catastrophic either, and it will eventually help to end the war. And there's one more factor which I suppose should be mentioned in this context as well. The West is painfully aware of its vulnerabilities. There have been so many news stories about Russian vessels being in places where Western critical infrastructure is located, that if the West escalates and helps Ukraine more or becomes directly involved in a war, then Russia will damage, for instance, our critical infrastructure. Russia doesn't have to, attack our cities with missiles, but if our energy, gas interconnectors are damaged, or other parts of critical infrastructure are damaged, then we might have a problem in the West.
But isn't it the reason enough to attack Russia's striking capacities to prevent Russia from expanding its threat? Because Russia has already threatened us. Russia has clearly organized some attacks on our territory. Russian drones flying over our military bases, and we know that Russia has a large network of sleeping agents who are preparing such attacks, and we regularly find explosive caches close to our pipelines, or we find sabotage networks, etc. I'm not talking about the clearly Russia attributed assassinations like the one with Novichok in the United Kingdom, or the assassination in Berlin with using a fire weapon, and isn't it clever to go into offensive and reduce Russia's fighting capacities than to wait before Russia wins over Ukraine, gets stronger, and will have even more leverage against us?
Yep, exactly. I think that the exact problem with the Western approach has been that the reluctance to give more to Ukraine and permit the use of Western weapons on Russian territory is leading to a situation where the prospect of Russia winning the war increases. And that's very dangerous. So it means that we're kind of, Russia already sees itself in a war with the West, and the West is just not doing enough in this war to protect Ukraine. So there's clearly a problem with the Western approach, and but there's also the issue of collective action, and there's also the issue of NATO security guarantees. So generating collective action is difficult. So within NATO, I mean, even getting Finland and then especially Sweden into NATO turned into a difficult task, while these states are clearly suited to be part of the Western alliance. So there's no problem there. And yet they are assets, and yet it was difficult for some reason. Agreeing on a more ambitious approach in the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine, agreeing on such a new or modified approach would be difficult, and that leads us to the discussion on NATO Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. So if, for example, some of NATO's member states would adopt a more ambitious approach, let's say if Poland does that, and let's assume that in the worst case, Russia retaliates in some way against Poland, would Poland be protected by Article 5? Because again, this notion of de-escalation, it just doesn't end. So it will be applied to new circumstances once again. So it's because of that, it is assumed to be safer for NATO states to not be directly involved and limit their assistance to Ukraine. I don't think that's very smart. I think that there's a real chance of the next war for Ukraine being really, really difficult, as one might expect in a war of attrition. So the strategy that has been pursued by the West until now is not producing the results that we want.
But isn't it a paradox somehow that the strongest military alliance of the world and of all times is afraid of being dragged into a war against a power which, as we know, is pretty limited in its military capacities and has failed in each and every of its goals in Ukraine since the last 3 years? Is it we know that Article 5 has been triggered only once in NATO, and it was not even about a state, it was about a terrorist organization far away from any country in other side of the globe. And when it comes to the alliance itself, every nation says, okay, do we really need to go that far? Because yes, we are alliance, yes, we have pledged to protect each other, but are we ready for this?
Well, activating NATO Article 5 after the September 11th attacks on the United States, that was easy because, in the aftermath of those attacks, Russia could, cooperate with the United States. So if states that are not part of the same alliance, if such states can cooperate, then within NATO alliance, it was even easier, and the Europeans were quite forthcoming with regard to United States security needs. Building a more ambitious common position vis-a-vis Russia would be more difficult. And the problem is that if you press too hard on NATO, then that more ambitious approach, it could tear NATO apart, because security interests of allies are similar, but they are not identical. And we know that these perceptions of security threats and approaches to the ongoing war within NATO, the approaches are different, and we know that. And if you try to impose a unified, ambitious approach, it could tear NATO apart and make it, in fact, a less effective military alliance. And it might, in the worst case scenario, it might result in some member states not fulfilling their obligations with regard to other members of the alliance. So in order to avoid this, I think the approach has been not to rock the boat, simply.
So, after all, like the task seems to be too high as long as the threat doesn't seem too dangerous for each and every member of the alliance. Let me ask you about the nuclear part of the equation. We know that the nuclear deterrence was the fundamental part of more or less peaceful coexistence of the Soviet Union and the Western alliance, and now Russia uses nuclear argument to deter the West from our support for Ukraine. How plausible is this threat, and what is the way out of this dead end? As practically you can do anything you want as long as you have nukes and threaten to do them, as long as you don't throw nukes against another nuclear power.
Russia's nuclear signaling has been very intensive, and looking at it from Russia's perspective, it has also been fairly productive, because it really has induced a lot of caution on the part of NATO alliance. Right now, I think, well, there was a moment, I believe that was the fall of 2022, then when in Washington, decision makers were concerned about Russia's potential use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine. That is long gone. That was 2 years ago. There's practically zero chance, I think, at this point that Russia would use a nuclear weapon. And really, why would they? Their approach to the war is succeeding. So Russia is waging a war of attrition against Ukraine, and it is succeeding to some extent. They would like to succeed faster, they would like to make larger gains and quickly, but the war is, I believe, how they see this in Moscow. The war is moving in Russia's favor. So there's no point in using nuclear weapons at this point when you're already kind of winning. I don't see Russian nuclear use as plausible at any point in the nearest future. But we will see a lot of signaling, because Russians would like to keep the temperature up, and they would like to keep us discussing nuclear weapons, while it's clear that Russia will not be using them against Ukraine. And also, if there's some escalation in NATO-Russia relations, the Russians would not escalate vertically, and they wouldn't like to turn this into a shooting war with NATO. Rather, they would attack Western critical infrastructure. There's plenty of opportunities there, I assume. So we're just discussing these nuclear issues, but it's I think it's pointless at this point. It's the wrong thing to discuss, even.
Absolutely. After all, what Russia achieves with this discussion, they paralyzes us. It's like attack on our informational infrastructure, on the topics of our discussion, on the topics of our decision making. Instead of dropping a nuke and demanding from us a response, which can be nuclear, the Russians achieve their goal of paralyzing the West by just dropping informational bombs, and that's what they do all the time. But to come to some sort of a positive part of the agenda, can we expect from the West production of a sort of unified but more progressive and hawkish agenda in this conflict?
I think there was this saying that the United States would do the right thing after it has tried everything else. And unfortunately for Ukraine, it seems that NATO might do the same thing with regard to Russia's aggression against Ukraine as well. The current approach is succeeding in a way that it keeps the potential of conflict between NATO and Russia low, but it's not succeeding in terms of giving Ukraine what it needs to defend itself. And it is unfortunately my impression that that the West might do more only under circumstances if there's a potential chance, a real chance that Ukraine might lose the war. And then the discussion within NATO might change. But there's obviously it's not just about bad news, right? So there's also good news, kind of. The German companies and other companies are providing more assistance to Ukraine. Rheinmetall will be or is operating and producing in Ukraine already. There will be more F-16s delivered to Ukraine, and it seems also that the economic and the military aid, the package is pretty much set. Russian money, Russian assets that have been frozen, those have been activated to finance Ukraine's defense as well to a certain extent. So there are good news as well. It's just that at this point in war, where Russia has broken through the lines of that Ukraine has held over the past 10 years, that's not a good sign, and that's not the result that we want to see in Ukraine. I think that the best case scenario at this point would be to give Ukraine enough so that Ukraine can clearly demonstrate to Russia that if Russia attacks, it's not going to make any gains or any reasonable gains in territorial sense, and that the losses of Russian side would kind of clearly demonstrate that Russia would run out of troops and equipment way sooner than Ukraine does, to demonstrate that attrition doesn't work in Russia's favor. Because at this point, I think the Russians might assume that attrition works in their favor. But the point would be to convince the Russians that attrition no longer works in their favor, and that is when we could have a real chance of the war kind of coming to an end, the active phase of the war coming to an end. It's not going to be peace either, probably, but at least the Ukraine would be able to take a breath after the past 3 years of intensive fighting.
And this is exactly what Ukraine is facing now. The Ukrainians have managed to keep Russian troops far from reaching Russian goals for almost 3 years in a row, with very few of the Western supply and Western support. And still Russia is gaining more land in Ukraine now, using Ukrainian weakness in manpower, in shells recently, and in other types of equipment like long-range missiles. So Russian territory is practically protected from long-range strikes, as Ukraine can hit Russian refineries, infrastructure, and other objects only with long-range drones, which Ukraine produces. And this is the main dilemma of this war. Can Ukraine hold as long as it's needed for the West to come to the right decision, or will Russia succeed here, despite the fact that Russia's army is underfinanced, is corrupt, is ill-guided, ill-commanded, but still they have more troops and more weapons, even if these weapons are of a very simple quality. That is the whole dilemma, which will impact the next months and maybe years of the European security, and we will surely come back to this topic. Again, we have talked to Dr. Toms Rostoks, who is a senior researcher at the National Defense Academy of Latvia, and his interests are deterrence, state intentions, and Russia foreign policy and strategy. Thank you, Dr. Rostoks.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, and share this interview with those who you think needs to listen to the insights of Dr. Rostoks.